Now!
It was a quiet Saturday morning in Chicago. The kind of morning where the streets are almost empty. The wind whispers between the high-rise apartments, and the city feels strangely still. David loved these rare moments of calm. He walked down his neighborhood, passing rows of brick buildings and small shops, and stopped at a local garage sale. Among the piles of old books, vinyl records, and dusty knickknacks, something caught his eye: a vintage mirror. Its frame was carved with intricate designs, faded from age, the kind of craftsmanship rarely seen today. It leaned against a wooden stand, slightly crooked, reflecting the sunlight in odd angles. David felt drawn to it. There was something almost magnetic about the way it caught his reflection. The seller, an older woman with a quiet smile, warned him lightly, "It's been in my family for years. Some say it's unusual." David laughed it off, thinking she meant old mirrors sometimes give strange reflections. He bought it, imagining it would look perfect above his apartment's fireplace. That evening, back in his high-rise apartment, David unwrapped the mirror and set it up. At first, it was exactly as expected. A simple reflection of his living room, the couch, the lamp, the small stack of books on the coffee table. He admired it for a moment and moved on with his evening, thinking nothing more of it. But as he walked past later, something felt off. His reflection hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second, it didn't move in sync with him. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. Everything seemed normal. He told himself he was imagining things. That night, he left the mirror in the living room and went to bed. But sleep didn't come easy. He couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was watching him. Every creak in the apartment sounded louder. Every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally. And the image of his own reflection lingered in his mind, just slightly out of place. By morning, David found himself checking the mirror more than once, half expecting it to be ordinary, half fearing it might not be. The city outside awoke with its usual noise: sirens, distant traffic, birds in the trees. Inside, the apartment was silent except for the quiet hum of the refrigerator. But the mirror seemed to pulse with a presence of its own. From that first glance, a seed of unease had been planted. The mirror was no longer just a piece of decor. It was something else, something that would not let him ignore it. And at that moment, David didn't yet understand that this seemingly ordinary mirror would slowly, deliberately, begin to rewrite his life in ways he could never escape. The story wasn't about the mirror alone. It was about what it held, what it reflected, and what it would eventually release. After bringing the vintage mirror into his Chicago apartment, David thought the worst of his unease was over. He had placed it against the wall, admired it for its craftsmanship, and gone about his evening. But as the night deepened, small, almost imperceptible differences began to reveal themselves in the reflection. At first it was minor, a blink that didn't perfectly match his own, a subtle pause when he reached for the coffee mug. He convinced himself it was exhaustion, a trick of the dim light, or perhaps the angle of the mirror catching shadows oddly. But each time he looked, the feeling grew stronger, like a low hum beneath his skin. Something was watching him, waiting, and it wasn't quite him. By the second night, the differences became more noticeable. The reflection's smile lingered slightly too long after he had turned away. Its eyes would track objects he hadn't noticed moving. David would walk across the room, and for a brief instant, the reflection would tilt its head in a direction he hadn't. Small gestures, but enough to make the hairs on his neck stand up. He started testing it, moving his hand slowly in front of his face, lifting a cup, standing on tiptoe. The reflection mimicked him, but there was always a fraction of a second delay, or sometimes a movement before he even completed the action. It was as if it anticipated him, predicting his motions. David's rational mind fought the fear it was a mirror. Mirrors reflect, that's all. Yet deep down he knew something was wrong. By the third night, the apartment itself seemed different. Shadows seemed longer, corners darker. The mirror's surface seemed to pulse subtly, catching reflections that weren't there. David caught glimpses of movement behind him. But when he turned, the room remained empty. And yet, in the mirror, the reflection's gestures had shifted. It no longer just copied him. It added subtle actions. Fingers tapping on a surface that wasn't there, a head tilt toward an empty corner, a quiet grin that didn't belong to him. David's anxiety grew. Every glance toward the mirror was accompanied by a tightening in his chest. The reflection was no longer a passive image. It had its own awareness. He tried covering it, turning it away, even walking past without looking. Nothing worked. Every night the reflection waited, patient, observing, and slowly, deliberately differentiating itself from him. The tension escalated quietly, insidiously. Even in daylight, David felt the mirror's presence. Its subtle differences whispered that this wasn't just a reflection. It was something else. Something learning, anticipating, and preparing. The ordinary object in his living room had transformed into a silent predator, and David knew, somewhere in the back of his mind, that ignoring it would not make it stop. Each small discrepancy, each tiny movement, was a warning. The mirror had begun to rewrite the rules. It was no longer a mirror. It was a door, and behind it something was waiting. By the fourth night in his Chicago apartment, David's unease had grown into a gnawing anxiety. The mirror no longer simply reflected him. It had started to act independently. At first it was subtle. A hand lifted slightly before he reached for his coffee. A blink that came a fraction of a second too early. But the differences became increasingly impossible to ignore. He tested it, moving slowly and deliberately. He raised his right hand, then his left, then took a step back. Each action was mirrored, but occasionally the reflection anticipated him, performing the movement just before he did. A chill ran down his spine. This was no ordinary mirror. Something inside it was learning him, predicting him, and acting on its own schedule. David began noticing phrases being mouthed by the reflection. Quiet, almost imperceptible whispers. Words he hadn't spoken yet, thoughts he hadn't even formed. One night, as he sat at his desk, exhausted, the reflection's lips moved slightly. David leaned closer, heart hammering. It whispered, "You're tired. Sleep now." A shiver coursed through him. He hadn't said those words aloud. The mirror knew him in ways that were frighteningly personal. Objects in the apartment began to subtly change as well. The reflection would lift a book, tilt a mug, or shift a lamp that hadn't moved before. Sometimes David would glance away for a second, and when he looked back, the objects were back in their original position, perfectly aligned. But the reflection continued to act, performing small, eerie gestures of its own. The psychological toll was immense. David's nights became restless. Every shadow, every corner of the apartment seemed alive. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, the reflection appeared in his mind, moving before he could move, smiling before he could even feel amusement. The apartment that had once felt like home now seemed like a trap, a stage for the mirror's slow domination of his reality. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe sleep deprivation was causing hallucinations. But even in the brightness of morning, the anticipation remained. A reflection that knew him better than he knew himself, that could act ahead of his own decisions. This was no trick of the mind. It was deliberate. It was conscious. And it was patient. By the end of the week, the reflection's actions had escalated further. It began repeating movements that David hadn't performed in years. Childhood gestures, old habits, moments he hadn't thought about in decades. The mirror wasn't just observing anymore. It was reaching back into his past, learning every nuance of his identity. And in those silent, relentless gestures, David realized the terrifying truth. This was no ordinary reflection. It was a version of him, a version that existed independently. It was preparing, waiting, acting ahead of him, slowly erasing the line between reflection and reality. Every glance into the mirror now carried the same dread. The reflection was no longer behind him. It was ready to step forward. By the sixth night, David's fear had escalated into full-blown paranoia. The mirror was no longer just a strange object in his Chicago apartment. It had begun to intrude on his life in ways he could barely comprehend. It wasn't merely reflecting him or acting slightly ahead anymore. It was mimicking him, perfectly copying his habits, gestures, and routines. He noticed small things first. The reflection would pour coffee in the exact way he liked it, tap his fingers on the desk just like he did when he was thinking, adjust the blinds to the same angle he always did. At first it was subtle, almost amusing, but soon the familiarity became terrifying. The reflection didn't just copy, it seemed to know him, anticipate him, and live his life in parallel. Then the evidence became undeniable. Photos he hadn't taken yet appeared on his phone, showing the reflection doing things in his apartment while he was elsewhere. Security cameras captured movements he hadn't made. At first, David thought he was losing his mind, but the pattern was consistent and unmistakable. Someone or something was inhabiting his identity. Every morning waking up brought the same chilling realization. The reflection had moved objects he hadn't touched, mimicked behaviors he hadn't performed, and left traces of a presence that wasn't him. Each interaction with the mirror intensified the feeling that he was being replaced, that his life was no longer solely his own. David's sleep became fractured, filled with dreams of seeing himself in impossible situations, walking through streets he had never visited, performing actions he hadn't done, all while the reflection watched silently from mirrors everywhere. Even when he closed his eyes, the mirror's influence lingered, like a shadow invading his thoughts. The psychological weight was overwhelming. Every glance at the mirror, every notification, every reflection in his apartment seemed to remind him that the line between himself and the reflection was blurring. He was no longer in control. Even simple tasks, pouring coffee, opening a door, typing a message, felt like the reflection was guiding or duplicating him. Sometimes before he could act, David attempted to cover the mirror, turn it away, even block it with furniture. Nothing worked. It remained a portal for the reflection, a way for it to continue its invasion. And with each day, the reflection became bolder, performing acts that were once private, intimate, or deeply personal, gestures only David would ever make. By the end of the week, the reflection's behavior had escalated to a terrifying crescendo. It seemed aware not just of his actions, but of his identity itself. Learning, anticipating, preparing. David realized that this was no longer about observation or mimicry. The mirror had begun to claim his life. It was practicing living as him, step by step, movement by movement, until one day it would replace him entirely. And in that realization, a new fear gripped him. It wasn't a question of if it would act. It was only a matter of when. The reflection was no longer behind the glass. It was waiting to step out, to fully assume the identity David had always taken for granted. By the final night, David's fear had reached a breaking point. Every glance at the mirror now carried the weight of inevitable confrontation. The subtle differences, the anticipatory movements, the invasion of his identity, they all led to this moment. He knew the reflection was no longer passive. It was preparing to step out of the mirror, to claim his life entirely. David paced his apartment in Chicago, the city lights filtering through blinds casting long, distorted shadows on the floor. Every creak of the building, every distant siren, seemed amplified in the silence of his fear. The reflection stood motionless, yet there was a presence in it that pressed against him like cold air, waiting patiently, menacingly. He tried reasoning, trying to find a flaw, any logic to break the mirror's hold, but nothing worked. The reflection's smile had grown unnaturally wide, eyes gleaming with knowledge only he should have possessed. It mirrored his every breath, yet there was a terrifying independence in its posture. As he stepped closer, it mimicked him too perfectly, yet not exactly. A hand raised before his hand, a head tilt slightly different, a blink fractionally early. The mirror had learned him, copied him, and evolved into something that was both him and not him. David's pulse quickened, his chest tightened. He realized the reflection no longer needed his consent. It was ready. Then it happened. The air seemed to thicken, almost vibrate. The reflection's hand pressed against the glass from the inside, and then, impossibly, it stepped forward. A part of the mirror warped and cracked as the figure emerged, moving with his exact gait, holding his familiar posture, but its smile was unnervingly wrong. It was David, yet it wasn't. Panic surged. David backed toward the door, but it was as if the reflection anticipated him, blocking every escape. The apartment felt smaller, corners bending, shadows elongating. His own reflection, the duplicate, stood before him, eyes glinting with knowledge and malice. Every secret, every fear, every private thought had been learned, mirrored, and weaponized. David realized the horrifying truth. This wasn't just a reflection. It was a copy, a replacement, a version of him that had practiced, learned, and evolved to step out of the mirror and occupy his life. And in that instant, before he could react, the figure lunged, merging with him in a way that defied reality. By morning, the apartment was quiet. The city's normal sounds continued outside. Cars, distant voices, the hum of Chicago waking up. But inside, David was gone. The mirror remained intact, hanging on the wall, reflecting the empty apartment as if nothing had happened. And in that mirror, a new figure waits, patient, silent, and ready for the next person who dares to look too closely. The apartment was empty, yet the reflection was alive, waiting. If you enjoyed terrifying stories that keep you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like, subscribe, hit the bell icon for more chilling horror content.